budget that, while didn't give us a surplus, so therefore wasn't perfect, I think it certainly would have exceeded expectations. On February 24th, with just 1 month left to go in the fiscal year, our average oil price was $64 US a barrel, just $1 below the budget 2019 projection, and in fact $1 higher than the mid-year projection. We were looking at a year with significant cost control, as you will see from today's update, because that hasn't changed. Our fiscal plan for the last 5 years has looked inward at how best to manage government programs and services. We have to balance that with a focus on investing in people, businesses, and sectors with the potential for economic growth. And our plans have been supported through collaboration with stakeholders representing several industry sectors. The plan was working, perhaps not as fast as some would have liked to have seen, but it was a balanced approach with steady progress. As we all know, in March, things changed drastically. In addition to the devastating impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on our economy, we were negatively impacted by the oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. On March 16th, the price of a barrel of oil dropped below $30 US, remaining below that price for the rest of the fiscal year. In fact, at the end of March, the price of a barrel of oil was below $20 US. Our 365-day average for oil dropped by $2 a barrel in less than a month. Over the fiscal year, lower oil prices alone contributed to a reduction of $64 million in revenues in 2019-20. March also brought a closed economy, less tax revenue, and more demand on government. All of this on top of Snowmageddon. As a result, today we are revising our projected surplus for 2019-20 to $1.7 billion. $1.27 billion. This represents a $287 million reduction in our projected surplus from our mid-year update projections. The Atlantic Accord factors in here. Due to government accounting standards, we were required to include this agreement booked in this fiscal year, or the fiscal year 2019-20. In the interest of transparency, let me say that without the Atlantic Accord, the projected deficit in 2019-20 would have been $1.1 billion. On the expense side, we continued with our rigid cost control with an overall net savings on expenses of $35 million. Our focus on cost control is more than just lip service. It has driven our actions over the past 4 to 5 years. This will be put to the test in future years, given the task that lays ahead of us. And I am proud of our ability to keep spending under control in 2019-20. The change is a result of lower than projected revenues. We were off track by $690 million. Since our mid-year update, in consultation with the Auditor General, it was determined that while government was correct in including the Atlantic Accord revenues in the year that they were booked, according to accounting standards, the Auditor General had advised that the $108 million tax revenue should be spread out over the life of the agreement. While this has had an impact on reducing revenues in 2019-20, it will increase revenues to an extent each year going forward. The remaining impact of $401 million includes a net reduction of $203 million in provincial taxes, and $198 million net reduction in other provincial, federal, and related revenues, including entities and government business enterprises. It goes without saying that the significant January snowstorm event, as well as the first 2 weeks of COVID-19 pandemic, had a negative impact on provincial revenues. If you think about it, since January 1st, we have had our province essentially shut down for almost a full month of the 2019-20 fiscal year. The average oil price for 2019-20 was $61.16 a barrel. That shows that over the course of March, with spiraling oil prices, the fiscal year average went from $64 to $61. The Canada-US exchange rate was 75.2 cents, a slight decrease from budget projections. Overall, oil revenues were $948 million in 2019-20, a decline of $181 million from budget projections. Despite these revenue impacts, our borrowing needs for 2019-20 remained unchanged from budget 2019 at $1.2 billion. Our net debt as a result of these revenue shifts increased from $14.2 billion. Despite the increase, it is still lower than the 2018-19 debt. While we are not in a position to provide a deep dive into 2020-21 today, we can anticipate significant revenue impacts this year as a result of higher unemployment, reduced business operations, and other COVID-19 related impacts. It would be reasonable to expect as well reductions in personal income tax, sales tax, and so on. We recently deferred or waived approximately $6 million in fees, which will have an impact on the 2020-21 fiscal year, but will also help spur on economic activity and support businesses in this province. Oil represents $1 billion in revenue for 2019-20. We anticipate we'll be lucky if we see half of that this year. On the expense side, we have put in place controls to reduce non-essential costs and to prioritize spending as needed. As a government, we've prioritized spending on essential services and responding to COVID-19. And just like all organizations throughout the world, we found new ways of doing business. Through technology and reduced travel, recruitment for non-critical positions is on hold with a focus of reassigning existing staff wherever possible. However, in provinces and territories across Canada, it is expected that COVID-19 will increase healthcare costs. While we are not in a position to provide you with a firm 2020-21 forecast, my commitment is that we will table a budget as soon as possible and to work with opposition parties on how we move forward in dealing with the challenges we face. We will be looking at service delivery and trying to learn from COVID-19, the experiences, and building on what has been successful, such as greater uptake in digital government services. As you've heard from our Premier and myself, our path forward requires federal government assistance and working with us on solutions. Every province and territory in this country has taken an economic hit during COVID-19. Some will have an easier time rebounding, while others will face an uphill climb, in particular, the oil-producing provinces. The path forward is going to be difficult, and we can't cut and tax our way out of this, as this would have a devastating effect on the people of the province and on our prospects for economic recovery. We also have to deal with rate mitigation and the impacts of COVID-19 and the Muskrat Falls project. These challenges highlight the need to work on collaborative solutions as well as working with the federal government. We are not asking for a handout. We are asking for fairness. In conclusion, we are prepared to work with stakeholders, to work with opposition parties, to work with Ottawa to navigate the economic and fiscal issues that we are facing. We were facing a fiscal crisis in this province in 2015-16, and while we still faced challenges prior to COVID-19, we had made significant progress in this province since 2016. We did this without equalization, without handouts. We did it through a balanced approach. However, the most recent setbacks impacts every province in this country, not just us, and will require partnership and collaboration, because we will all have to work together to overcome this. The next year or two will present this province with additional challenges, and the decisions we have to make may not always be easy. But while people in every province are dealing with the adversity of COVID-19, the people of Newfoundland and Labrador have a history of overcoming adversity. I know we can get through this together. As part of that, once travel restrictions are lifted, I am inviting my opposition critics in the PC Party and the NDP to join me as part of a delegation when we meet face-to-face with MPs in Ottawa and we continue to discuss the challenges facing this province and how we can work together on solutions. Thank you. We are open for questions.
Thank you, Minister Osborne. We will now begin with the questions, and we have 8 reporters on the line this morning. Up first, we have Patrick Butler with Radio Canada. Please go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Osborne. Just a question regarding government has had a goal of returning to surplus by 2022, 2023. I'm assuming that that might be off the table, but could you confirm whether that's the case?
Thank you, Patrick. That is a good question. As we were leading into budget, I had indicated that it was, we were still focused on returning the surplus. Returning the surplus by 22-23 would have been challenging. With the most recent challenges of COVID-19 and the spiraling oil prices, I will confirm that it is not possible to get back to surplus by 22-23. I will say that while we are still focused on returning the surplus, as we are able to put together a reasonable and accurate economic forecast in terms of a budget, we will outline our new return to surplus plans.
You mentioned that you anticipate half of the oil revenues that you receive this year will probably disappear for the current fiscal year. How significant? I just want to talk a little bit more about how significant that will be in terms of services that the provinces can provide, and if we remove $500 million from provincial coffers and to what we can spend on, I mean, where do you look for in terms of making up that money?
Well, it will be challenging, Patrick. The reality is, in addition to half of the oil revenue, we can anticipate business, personal income tax, sales tax, other sources of revenue to be affected as well. While we had essentially a month of the 12 months last year where the economy was shut down, this year the fiscal year started April 1st. We're already into June, so the economy was essentially shut down almost completely for a couple of months. And as we enter into the next level of living with COVID-19, we can certainly expect that it's going to take some time before the economy rebounds to what it was for certain. So all sources of revenue will be impacted. So again, I stress the need for a collaboration between other provinces, with the federal government, between all members of the legislature in this province, working with businesses as we see our way through this. To more directly answer your question, I fully anticipate that in the shorter term there will be more reliance on borrowing, but we also need to focus heavily on new ways of doing business to reduce expenses and to find efficiencies. We need to become even more aggressive with that. We are not in a position and will not lower the standard of living or the services provided in this province below what is considered to be an acceptable national standard. Nobody today can say we're above the national standard, the average across the country in terms of services, but people in this province have just as much a right to a balanced level of services as any other province in the country.
And we had $1.2 billion in debt, in spending on servicing the debt, out of $8.4 billion in total expenditures. How, as the need for borrowing increases, how much of that is a worry for you in terms of being able to, how worried are you that debt servicing continues to take up ever more and more of the amount of money that you have to work with?
It is a concern. I think it's a concern not only for myself and the Premier and our Cabinet and caucus, but for everybody in the province. We've worked very diligently on reducing the deficit in this province. Again, in 2015-16, we were at a fiscal crisis. We continued to face challenges, but we'd reduced the deficit from $2.4 billion in 2015-16 to less than $600 million last year. So the progress speaks for itself. In fact, our bond rating agencies talk about that one of the greatest strengths in keeping our bond ratings up in this province is the sound fiscal management of the Treasury in this province. One of the biggest downward pressures is Muskrat Falls and the need to deal with Muskrat Falls and rate stabilization. So we continue to face challenges. Those challenges now are even more so as a result of the COVID pandemic and spiraling oil prices. So we need collaboration. We need to put politics aside, and we need to work on solutions in this province. We've seen that work to a great degree with the All-Party Committee on dealing with COVID. So we absolutely need to find ways of working together in order to deal with this.
Thank you, Minister. Next on the line, we have Holly McKenzie-Suter with the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Hello. Question about the projected $500 million in oil revenue next year. Just given all the shutdowns in the offshore and reductions in prices, I'm wondering if you can explain in more detail where that $500 million is expected to come from.
Again, I think in my last answer, we will have in the shorter term obviously a need for some additional borrowing. We will look for other efficiencies. We've proven during COVID the uptake in online services through government, through digital government, has grown exponentially. So that will be a savings for government. We'd said in recent months that the savings from shared services and digital government were a little slower than anticipated. There's not much positive came out of COVID, but one of the positive outshoots is perhaps the fact that people have turned to digital government and operating online. That may help move our shared services more quickly, and that will obviously be a savings for government. There are other areas where we need to focus strategically on finding efficiencies and savings. The federal government have a role here, and not to be disparaging towards any of our Atlantic Canadian provinces. But if you were to take equalization away from either of those provinces, they would have been facing the same challenges we were facing over the last 3 or 4 years. So we're not asking for a handout from Ottawa. We are asking for fairness. Our geography in this province is larger than the other 3 Atlantic provinces combined. We've got the second smallest population and an aging population in this province. Second smallest population of any province in Canada. It obviously costs more to provide services in this province than it does in the other Atlantic provinces. We've got considerably more snow clearing requirements and road maintenance. We've got coastal ferries that they don't rely on in other provinces. Air ambulance costs are higher here. There are more healthcare facilities because the population is dispersed over a very large geography. We need to find efficiencies, but we also need to find fairness in federal programs.
Thank you. So when you say, asking for fairness in these programs, can you be more specific about what you're asking for from Ottawa?
Again, if you'd removed equalization from either of the other 3 Atlantic provinces, their fiscal situation would have been very similar to ours over the last 3 or 4 years. So that's what I mean by fairness. Equalization has not lived up to its intent under the Constitution, the 1982 Constitution, which very clearly articulates that equalization is meant to provide a comparable level of services at a comparable level of taxation. So we will certainly be looking for whether it's equalization or whether it's fiscal stabilization or whether it's other newer forms or of Ottawa helping provinces, especially as provinces deal with COVID. We will be looking for our fair share in terms of what's provided to this province.
Thank you. And you brought up Muskrat Falls and rate mitigation. I'm wondering where that whole situation and negotiations with Ottawa fall on the province's priorities right now. And I guess how realistic the outlook is for getting a firm plan on how to deal with that when, as you mentioned, all the other provinces are having their own financial challenges.
It remains a priority. It obviously got sidetracked as the primary focus of this province and of Ottawa was dealing with COVID and the pandemic, and the first and foremost priority was the health of the people of the country and the people of the province. But talks resumed. Talks continue with Ottawa and this province. I know the Premier has been in discussion with the Prime Minister. I've been in discussion with the Federal Minister of Finance, and officials from a number of departments continue to dialogue with officials in Ottawa. It remains a top priority for both this province and for Ottawa.
Thank you, Minister. Next on the line, we have Mike Connors with NTV News. Please go ahead.
Hi, Minister. The interim supply runs out, I believe, the end of September. You say you want to table a budget as soon as possible. So are we going to see a budget this summer, or are you planning to present another interim supply bill to the House?
It's certainly my intent to see a budget prior to at the end of September. That is our intent. We obviously, knowing that the federal government has indicated they're going to be providing economic stimulus and that they will be there for the provinces. This year, more than ever, it's important to find out what's in the federal budget as we put together the provincial budget. But I know that officials in the Department of Finance, once they were able to put together the economic update on the closeout of the 2019-20 fiscal year, the attention is now turned towards budgeting. Let me just reiterate that a budget is an economic forecast of what the economy, how the economy is going to perform, of what revenues are going to be, what expenses are going to be for the province. At this particular stage, I don't think there's a province across the country who could accurately tell you what revenues and expenses are going to be today, what oil royalties are going to be, for example, in this province or the other three oil-producing provinces. So if we're going to put together an accurate forecast of revenue, expenses, and what the economy is going to look like, we need to have a solid understanding of what those indicators are, and that's something that officials in the Department of Finance are now working on.
You've been approved for up to $2 billion in borrowing this fiscal year. How much of that have you used so far, and are you expecting to have to request more borrowing on top of the $2 billion?
So far, we've completed 60% of the $2 billion that we've received authority through the House of Assembly to borrow. So $1.2 billion. As we move forward, as we continue to move forward and get a better understanding of what revenues will be for the province, we'll be in a better position to accurately project what borrowing requirements will be.
And you've talked about the need for assistance from Ottawa and joining with the opposition in a delegation to Ottawa for help. But does the province need, these fiscal problems have been around for a long time now, does the province need to do more to show what it's doing to get its own financial house in order before you can expect any more help from Ottawa?
Again, I think, it's very fair to say, and, I invite anybody who's got access to the reports from the bond rating agencies. They articulate very clearly that one of the strengths in keeping our bond rating where it is the solid fiscal management of the Treasury in this province. I don't think that the concern is the Treasury. They've looked at the Muskrat Falls as the largest contingent liability and perhaps the largest downward pressure on our bond ratings. We've reduced our provincial deficit from $2.4 billion to less than $600 million last year. While many would like to have seen faster progress in that regard, we looked at a balanced approach, one that wouldn't put a fragile economy in any further jeopardy than it was, but at the same time making steady progress to eliminating that deficit. We'll continue with that steadfast approach, but we absolutely need to focus even more strongly on efficiencies, on attrition, on new ways of doing business in the province. There will be some difficult decisions. There's absolutely no question about that because of the setbacks, but we were making very solid progress. Again, our bond rating agencies have identified that we've met or exceeded our targets in every year. So we were moving in the right direction. The focus now has to be, getting back to reducing deficits and finding efficiencies and finding out what Ottawa are able to help us with. Again, I cannot stress enough that if you removed equalization from either of the other Atlantic provinces, their fiscal situation would not be much different than what we'd seen over the last 4 or 5 years here.
Thank you, Minister. Next on the line, we have Anthony Germain with CBC. Please go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Osborne, would it be fair to say that there is right now no COVID-19 economic recovery plan for the province?
I wouldn't say that that's fair at all, Anthony.
So where's the plan?
Well, just yesterday I announced stimulus for housing and renovations. I know the Minister of Tourism has announced a stimulus program for the hospitality and tourism sector, and I know there's another program for that sector that's being worked on as we speak. There are other programs that other ministers will be announcing in the very near future as well. I know Mr. Mills has been employed to look at economic recovery plans. Keep in mind, Anthony, COVID was sprung on every province in Canada in March. Nobody was prepared for it, but I think one of the areas that I can say that Ottawa has been absolutely helpful is in programs to help people get through COVID-19, in wage subsidies and top-ups and rental assistance and other programs. We've partnered with them on some of those, but we very quickly started putting the first and foremost the focus on public health and safety. And I think anybody would have said that it would have been absolutely insensitive to not have that as our first and foremost priority. But now that we've been able to flatten the curve, there is a very solid focus by the Premier and every minister in our cabinet on economic recovery.
As we're shifting to that economic recovery and determining what the plan is, in the course of this news conference, Minister, you've mentioned equalization a number of times. I think it's fairly certain for anyone who's observing what's going on in Ottawa that the federal government has no intention of reviewing equalization until 2024. So would it be fair to say that any plan for the financial recovery of this province relies on the federal government coming to our rescue?
I think it's fair to say it doesn't have to be equalization. Yes, I've mentioned equalization several times. Let me be absolutely clear. It doesn't have to be equalization, but equalization is the current program, so that's the program that I've referred to. It can be fiscal stabilization, or it can be other programs that Ottawa may look to balance the fairness. But I can absolutely say with certainty in dealing with my colleagues across the country, we're not the only province dealing with this. The three obviously hit the hardest are the oil-producing provinces, but every province across the country has been hit, with the economic side of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it's fair to say that for each and every province, including ours, that part of the solution is collaboration with Ottawa and assistance from Ottawa. I think that's fair to say.
I think there's my last question. I think that, do I get three, don't I? Two and a follow-up?
Well, there were two, but go ahead.
I think there's recognition, Mr. Osborne, that our province is certainly probably in the most serious shape. And the fact is, when the federal government has bailed out other provinces like Saskatchewan in 1983, there are conditions that come with that. You signed on to and renewed a no layoff clause with our largest public sector union. So my question is, how can we make the spending reductions that might be required of us, given that you negotiated away the flexibility to reduce the size of the public sector?
We've had a significant reduction in the public sector through attrition. I think we need to become even more focused on attrition. The agreements in good faith these agreements were largely negotiated and agreed on prior to COVID. I can say that the collective or public sector unions that we had not reached an agreement with prior to COVID, we are not proceeding with the extension, the 2-year extension. It's not our intention to proceed with that with other public sector unions. But with the 2 unions we have reached agreement with, they were largely settled prior to COVID. We had seen a significant reduction in numbers as a result of attrition. Many would say it's not enough. I don't disagree with that, but I think the success and the reduction in the size of the public service is there. In December of last year, we put legislation through the House of Assembly that gives government the ability to work with our agencies, boards and commissions on identifying attrition planning, on identifying staffing complements and looking at a way forward and working with our agencies, boards and commissions. That work is largely underway, and the staff in HRS has been working with our agencies, boards and commissions to identify areas that we can make efficiencies and working with them. That work is going to continue, and I think we need to have an even stronger focus on that as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Next on the line, we have Rob Antle with CBC. Please go ahead.
Hi, Minister. In the last budget speech, you said the province was turning the corner to a brighter future at that time. Where is the province right now a year later?
Well, I think anybody would be surprised if they didn't understand the implications of the spiraling oil prices and the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not just our province. It's not just Canada. It's affected. Had an effect globally. I think it's fair to say that while we made significant progress, we still face challenges. There's no question about that. We would have continued to say that there were challenges there until we'd returned to surplus and completely eliminated the deficit. But through the work of our Premier and our Cabinet and our caucus, we'd reduced the deficit from $2.4 billion to less than $600 million. So I think it is fair to say we'd made significant progress while there were still challenges. But the challenges now are even greater because of the global pandemic and because of oil prices. We obviously have an oil industry who has been largely affected. We've seen that in the news recently. We've seen in the news the North Atlantic Oil Refinery as an example, a very large employer for the first time in decades that was run very efficiently and profitably over the past couple of years, and huge investments put in there. But even with something that had huge investments and being run so much more efficiently than it had ever been run, that couldn't escape the effects of the global pandemic. So there are additional challenges to what we faced prior to this, while we were making steady progress. And again, I'll say that was recognized by our bond rating agencies, that we were making steady progress. This recent events of the pandemic and the oil price spiral, is certainly a setback. So that's where we are today. I think financial officials in every province and federally continue to evaluate where we are and what the future is going to look like. But I can absolutely assure you that our government, and I hope every member of the legislature in this province is steadfast in finding our way through this and getting us back on a solid fiscal foundation.
Just to, I guess, follow up on something Mike mentioned earlier, the province so far, I believe you said, has borrowed $1.2 billion, I believe, in about the first 6 weeks of this fiscal year. That's the same amount that the province borrowed in the entire 12 months of the last fiscal year. Is the fact that the province needed to borrow as much in the first 6 weeks of this year as it did in the entire 12 months of last year indicative of the gravity of the situation facing Newfoundland and Labrador right now? Can you address that?
I think it's indicative of the fact that the economy was shut down since mid-March, that oil prices, which were in the mid-60s per barrel, had gone down as low as $20 a barrel. I think it's indicative of the fact that we all understand that expenses in the province related to dealing with COVID were affected, and revenues in the province were affected, and the economy was essentially shut down. I think we did what we had to do to get through this, and we'll continue to do what we need to do in order to get through this global pandemic. And things like we announced yesterday for home renos and home construction, spurring on the economy and getting people to work, and providing through that assistance to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador as well. Those things will obviously take investment by the province, but I think they're absolutely essential to spur on the economy and get the economy up and running again. And we'll continue to look for ways of boosting the economy and getting people back to work and helping people through this, while at the same time looking for ways to find efficiencies within government.
Just a quick follow-up. The province had indicated in a letter to the Prime Minister, the Premier did, that it was having trouble borrowing back in March. Did you have similar problems when you went to the markets in April and May to get this borrowing?
No. At the time the Premier wrote that letter, the borrowing aspect of the letter was a snapshot in time, and we'd since learned that every province in Canada were facing similar concerns. The federal government had the Bank of Canada step in for short-term borrowing to assist the provinces. We availed of some of that, but we've borrowed $1.2 billion without the assistance of the federal government since that letter. We've borrowed at very reasonable rates. So the money that we've borrowed, the long-term borrowing, has all been without the assistance of the federal government. Once markets settled and there was greater stability in the bond markets, every province, I think, felt the more positive effect of being able to go to market and meet their requirements.
Thank you, Minister. Next on the line, we have David Marr with the Telegram. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. You had mentioned, so there's 690 less in revenue at this point. You'd mentioned that the downturn in oil prices only accounted for about $64 million in terms of less revenue, and we're only capturing 2 weeks of the COVID-19 shutdown with this fiscal update. So I'm wondering if you could provide some kind of idea as to how much of the increased deficit, how much can you attribute that to the oil prices and the COVID shutdown versus other factors, for example, the January snow event?
Well, oil was down $181 million from budget 2019 to the closeout of the fiscal year. It was $64 million was attributable to lower oil prices, I believe. There was $108 million due to Atlantic Accord tax deferrals. Again, the Auditor General had agreed that the accounting principles of accounting for the Atlantic Accord in the 2019-20 fiscal year was appropriate and reasonable, but had recommended to the province that the tax portion of the well over $2 billion in Atlantic Accord revenue, which accounted for $108 million, the tax portion or the tax revenue from the Atlantic Accord, the Auditor General would prefer to see that accounted for in each tax year as a result of it being tax revenue. So that accounted for $108 million. The $203 million was a reduction in provincial taxes and $198 million in other reductions, other revenue reductions. Yes, there is no question that COVID accounted for just over 2 weeks of the fiscal year. When you combine that with Snowmageddon, which was 8 days of business shutdown for a large part of the business community in the province, we essentially saw almost an entire month out of 12 in this province that had a significant economic impact, a significant reduction in revenue, not only for the business community but also for government.
Could I ask for a little more specificity in terms of, like I said, the January snow event, Snowmageddon? How much did that cost the province, and how much, lost revenue did we see as a result of that one event?
I'm not sure if we can actually pinpoint it to that, but I'll ask my deputy to step in. And are you able to pinpoint exactly what is attributable to Snowmageddon?
I don't have any numbers right this second. I do know that we are working through a process with respect to Snowmageddon related to the Disaster Assistance Fund. And so part of the costs that occurred would also involve municipalities' costs as well as provincial costs.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And once again, Minister Osborne, you had mentioned that you can't tax and cut our way out of this. If you're having discussions with the federal government, surely there must be a position of the province in these negotiations. Can you with being as specific as you can you tell us how much money is the province of Newfoundland asking the federal government for at this point? Knowing that the numbers will change over the course of negotiations.
I don't think we're in a position at this particular point to pinpoint that. I know that we have let Ottawa know. We have very clearly articulated the position the province is in. The letter, as one example, that the Premier wrote is widely circulated and understood by the general public to be there. There have been several discussions between both levels of government on a variety of issues, and those discussions will continue.
Thank you, Minister. Next on the line, we have John Woodside with allnewfoundlandlabrador.com. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I understand you're not in a position today to present a firm outlook for 2020, 2021. Months into this fiscal year already, so I'm wondering if you can share some more details.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your question at all. I'm not sure if it's your phone or our system, but if you could repeat it.
Can you hear me okay now?
It's a little better. We'll certainly try.
I'm just really asking for some more details about when we might see a budget for the upcoming year, and if there is any sort of projected deficit yet for the coming fiscal year as well.
Okay, I heard most of that. I think I understand your question. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're asking for some sort of outlook on what the 2020-21 year will look like. At this particular stage, it's very difficult to say. We're now just entering level 3 of living with COVID. There are more businesses able to open. We don't yet have a full understanding of what how the economy is going to rebound. at this particular stage. I know we're asking people to vacation at home and stay home, but you know it largely depends on what the economy looks like. You know, we think we've got a better understanding. I wouldn't say it's entirely accurate because we're still dealing with COVID. As we all know, the price of a barrel of oil is largely driven by supply and demand. And as globally people start to see their economies pick up, you know, what does the demand on oil look like? Therefore, what does the price of a barrel of oil look like? You know, that's still to a certain degree, pardon the pun, but it's still to a certain degree fluid. You know, so I think if we were to present a budget today, the variances in that budget would be considerably different than the variances on a year-over-year basis. Officials in the Department of Finance like to see the economic forecast when we lay out a budget to be within 1% variance, meaning that 99% accurate on a forecast. I don't think if we were to put a forecast in place today that we could say it would be 99% accurate.
Thank you. And you pointed out a couple times during this press conference that the bond rating agencies have highlighted the strength of financial management in the province, you know, which is absolutely true. But for a rating agency like Moody's, they've also said that the biggest drags on the province are the exposure to the price of oil shocks. So in other words, too many eggs in one basket, and the debt posed by Muskrat Falls. So it's a little curious to hear that the economic fallout of Muskrat Falls has flipped in terms of its priority, and at the same time there's a lot of talk of how to keep supporting the oil industry even more. So I'm wondering if you can offer a sense of what, if any, discussions are happening in the province to build a stronger economic foundation, noting these significant drags that the bond rating agencies are calling out.
Okay, again, it's very difficult to hear your question, so I think based on what we were able to hear, that I've got an understanding of what your question is. I think it was what measures are going to be put in place to build an economic foundation. We've got Mr. Mills has just recently been employed by the province to work on some aspects of that cabinet and the Premier. We've got the Cabinet Committee on Jobs that meet every week, and we'll continue to do that. We are not only looking at what is currently existing in the province in terms of economic advantages, in terms of opportunities. We're looking at how we can strengthen what's currently here, and potentially on new ways of doing business. So I'm hoping that answers your question. Again, it was very difficult to hear it.
Thank you.
Next on the line, we have Brian Medora with CLCM. Please go ahead.
Earlier, Minister, you spoke of the new way of doing business, an obvious reference to working from home. A lot of opinions on that. Some think that it's largely the same volume of labor required. Some think that no, you can save a lot of money, not the same number of employees required. Maybe there's something in the middle. Any great pilot project on the go right now. Has government any plans to kind of drill down, find out if, say, costs have increased, decreased, more overtime has gone in, less overtime has gone in, how this can play out in the future?
Okay, Brian, again, I think it's our system here because it was very, very difficult to hear what you're saying. I'm not sure.
Okay, and just if once everything is back to normal, is it just everyone goes back to work as normal, or will government drill down to find out how this we'll call it an unplanned pilot project of working from home panned out? Is it a situation where people can continue to work from home? Do you require less physical of an operation to carry out the public service?
That is a good question. You did come in loud and clear then, Brian. We are evaluating that as we speak. I know HRS is looking at it. Next Monday, we've got about 20% of the workforce, and I think there's been a focus on areas where working from home was less efficient than working in the office. There are individuals who are working at home, and in fact, productivity has increased for many individuals. There are many individuals who are frontline employees right now. If you look at healthcare employees, they're still frontline and obviously not able to work from home for the most part. So it depends on the sector you're looking at, but within the government buildings, the 3 buildings that make up the Confederation Complex, roughly 20% are returning once we enter level 3 of living with COVID. The folks who've had the highest level of productivity at home will probably be amongst the last to be called in, but we are evaluating, and that's one of the things that we may be able to look at as we move forward, whether or not we can reduce government's footprint in terms of bricks and mortar, heat and light, if productivity is higher with some sectors of the public service working from home, for example.
And just one other question. How close are we, or how concerned are you of seeing us fall back into that 2015, 2016 situation of $2+ billion, already 1.1, still many poor months to come? Oil, you say, if we get $500 million, we'll be lucky. That could carry on for a while. $2.2 billion does not seem that far off. How concerned are you that could be in the offing, that going back to that 2015, 2016 situation?
Well, there's 2 aspects to that question. I'll ask my deputy to step in as well, but debt and deficit don't always go hand in hand. The amount you borrow and your deficit is not always hand in hand. You can certainly make linkages and comparisons, but this year will certainly be an anomaly based on the fact that we're still very much dealing with the global pandemic, and we're still very much dealing with the fact oil prices are nowhere near what we would have considered normal at this particular time. So while this is an anomaly, whether or not we weather the storm in terms of deficit this year and things look a little more back to normal next year, it's too early to tell. There's no vaccine for COVID at this particular stage. Whether or not we have a second wave or how that affects us, it's really too early to tell. These are some of the unknowns, the things we can't control. But we're certainly working our way through it, and once we see life get back to the new normal, and the economy up and running, we'll be in a much better position to elaborate on that. Denise?
I think, Minister, you covered the main points. A budget has a lot of assumptions in it. At this point, we would need to have informed assumptions with respect to the economy, the way revenue projections would be. We probably have a little bit more insight from an expenditure perspective, as we know a lot more details about those types of things. But for the revenue is so tied closely to those economic assumptions, as well as the federal government programs and what they mean for the province. So at this point, there's still a lot of unknown and a lot of assumptions that would need to be made in order to inform some reasonable projection for the current year.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. The time for questions is now ended. Please forward along any follow-up questions you have by email. Thank you for participating in today's availability.
Thanks, everyone.